Hey guys, hope everybody's doing all right. So this is going to be like the last set of notes from our graphing sine and cosine section. So I kind of retyped it up because I've been meaning to redo it for a couple years now. So what we're going to be doing is looking at a graph of sine and cosine and seeing if we can come up with the equation. So it's kind of a little bit of working backwards, okay? Now the cool thing is that you're going to be able to write a sine and cosine equation for every graph, right? It all just depends on the point that you start with, and that'll tell you which equation that you're going to use, okay? So the first bullet point is figure out if you're going to write sine or cosine. If it's at a high point or a low point, it's going to be cosine. If it starts at the middle, right, it's going to be a sine, right? So think about when you guys were graphing, cosine always started at a high or it started at a low point, depending if it had a reflection. And then if you start in the middle, right, if you're starting on the principal axis, that's going to be a sine curve, okay? So just keep that in mind. The second point is figure out where your axis is. This is the value for D, all right? So if you're looking at the standard form for sine and cosine, your axis is going to be the value for D, right? So if you have a vertical shift up or down, right, that'll tell you where the axis is. So it's typically in between the highest and the lowest points. So in between highest and lowest points. Okay, so for example, say my lowest point was at y equals 0, and my highest point was at y equals 6, right? The middle of that would be y equals 3, right? So that would be the value of my letter for D. So figure out then for number 3, the height of the curve above your principal axis, right? So how many points does it go above where the axis is? This is going to be your amplitude and also your A value. Okay, and then number 4, to figure out the period, right, up until this point, right, to figure out the period, if we had the equation, we took the 2 pi and then divided it by the b term, and that gave you the value for the period, right, the length of one cycle. Okay, now if we're working backwards, okay, I'm going to need the b value to write the equation. Okay, so if I cross multiply here, okay, what I'm going to get is the b term is going to be equal to 2 pi divided by the period. All right, so you're going to be able to figure out how long the period is by looking at the graph, and then if you divide that into 2 pi, that will tell you what the value for b is. And then if you have a horizontal shift left or right, that'll tell you the value for c, and then once you have all of that, you can write your equation. Okay, so looking at the first one, all right, it's going to depend on where we start the point at. Okay, that'll tell us whether it's a sine curve or a cosine curve. Okay, so looking at what I have, I see that my lowest value is at -1, right? It's right about here. And then my highest value here is at 5. Okay, so that tells me the middle of that, right? It has to be +2. So what I'm going to do is draw my axis here at +2. All right, so that means that the value for D in my equation is going to be +2. Okay. Now, if I pick this first value here at y equals 2, okay, the length of one cycle, right, is going to end up right here. Okay. So the period for this, right, is going to be 1 pi. Okay, so to figure out the b term, what I'm going to do is just take 2 pi and divide it by the period that I just found. Okay, so that would be 2 pi over 1 pi, which is going to come out to be 2. Okay, now I have, if I'm looking at where my axis is, right, the amplitude is how much you go above and below, right? So if I have my axis is at 2, I'm going all the way up to 5, right? That tells me that my amplitude obviously has to be 3, right? And if you check the other point, you go from 2 all the way down to 1, negative 1, sorry, that also is a distance of 3, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this first point to write my equation, okay? So I have y equals, so my amplitude was 3, sine of, we said the b term was 2, right? So I should just have 2x inside the parentheses, right? There's no shift because I'm starting at x equals 0, so there's no shift there. So I can just leave it as 2x and then plus 2, okay? So that is one example of a sine curve, okay? Now, if you want to jump over to the next one, the high point, right? This, since I'm starting at a high point, this has to be cosine, okay? Now, the nice thing about this writing the equation is that everything is going to stay the same except your horizontal shifts, okay? So it looks like the x value, right, is right in between pi over 6 and pi over 3, okay? Now, if you guys remember the unit circle, right, that's going to be pi over 4, okay? Now, if you didn't know that, right, you can just take the average of the two to figure out exactly, okay? So that's going to be pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 6, which is then 3 pi over 6. Right, did I do that right? Yeah. Sorry. So that's going to be pi over 2, right? And then I need to divide that by 2, right? Because I'm adding two terms together. So that's going to be pi over 4, right? So the middle of that would be pi over 4. Okay, so when I write my equation now, because it's a high point, it's going to be positive cosine. So it's going to be 3 cosine. Now my b value is still 2. That doesn't change. Okay, but now I have a shift to the right pi over 4. So it's going to be x minus pi over 4, like that. And then plus 2. All right, so using this point to start with, that's what my equation is, right? Now, if you guys were to get your graphing calculators out and put both of these equations in, they would line up with each other. They would line exactly on top of each other. Okay. Now we'll do one more just for an example. So say I pick this one, all right, because it's on the axis. Okay. Now everything again is going to stay the same, except if I'm starting at the axis, it's going to be sine. And you see how I'm going down first instead of going up? That tells me that it's going to be negative 3 instead of positive 3. So this is going to be y equals negative 3 sine of 2, and then it's a shift to the right pi over 2, because that's the x value, plus 2. Okay? So again, if you graphed all three of those, they would line up on top of each other. All right? So let's jump down to the next one. Okay, so I see that the highest point that I have is 1, and the lowest is negative 3, right? So the middle of that must be negative 1. Okay, so my axis is going to move down negative 1. Okay, my amplitude, right, because that's the distance, right? My amplitude's got to be 2. All right, now if I start here at this highest point, right, which is going to be like a cosine curve, it finishes at 2 pi, right? So the period is going to be 2 pi, right? So then the b term is just 2 pi over 2 pi, or 1, okay? And then because we're starting at this first x equals 0, there's going to be no shift, all right? So because it's a high point, you're doing cosine, so it's 2 cosine of the b term, which is 1x, so you can just write it as x, and then minus 1. Okay? Now the sine one, right, if you wanted to do it here, okay? Now because this is the axis and then you go into the low point, right, that's going to be a reflection of the sine curve. So I'm going to make this y equals negative 2 sine 1x. Now the shift, I'm moving it right pi over 2. So it's going to be x minus pi over 2. And then minus 1. Okay? So that's 1 sine and then 1 cosine. All right, the next one. So my lowest point is negative 3, and my highest point is 3, okay? So that tells me that my axis is right here at 0, so there's actually no vertical shift with this one. All right, my amplitude is going to be 3, so I'm going up to positive 3, down to negative 3. All right. What else can we find? Okay. All right. So if I have this point right here, right, which is right on the axis, okay. Now it's in between 0 and pi over 3, right, which is going to be pi over 6, okay. And then in between 2 pi and 7 pi over 3, right? That's going to be one cycle, right? Because you have axis, high, axis, low, axis again, right? So in between 2 pi and 7 pi over 3, right? If you guys take the average of that, okay, you're going to get 13 pi over 6, okay? So to figure out my period between those 2 points, I'm just going to find the difference. So 13 pi over 6 minus 1 pi over 6, all right, which is 12 pi over 6, or 2 pi, okay? So if my period is 2 pi, then my b term is again going to be just 1, okay? Now, if I start at that point at pi over 6, I have a shift now to the right, pi over 6. So I just need to be careful of that. So I have my amplitude, I have my period, I have my axis. Okay, so I can write the equation. So we're starting at pi over 6 now instead of 0. So this is going to be y equals 3 sine of x minus pi over 6. And then there's no shift up or down. So then that's my equation. Okay, and then if I start with my high point here, right, that's going to be positive cosine. So this is y equals 3 cosine of x minus 2 pi over 3. Okay, so again, those two equations, they're going to give you the same graph. Okay, so letter C now. So my lowest is 1, my highest is 3, so the middle must be 2. All right, so my axis is at 2. All right, my amplitude has to be 1 because you're going 1 unit higher and 1 unit lower. Okay. Now I'm starting here at 0, and I'm ending that looks to be like a sine cycle is here at 2 pi over 3, okay? So my period would be 2 pi over 3, okay? So the value for b now is going to be 2 pi divided by 2 pi over 3, which is 6 pi over 2 pi, or just 3, okay? So I have the value for b now, and now I can write my equation, okay? Now, because, again, my graph starts at 0 and then it goes down, this is going to be negative sine, all right? So it's y equals negative sine of the b term, which is 3, no shifts because we're starting at 0, and then plus 2. All right, and then if you pick the other point here, okay, this is starting at a low point, okay? So this is going to be a negative cosine instead of positive cosine. So this is y equals negative cosine 3 x minus pi over 6 plus 2. Okay? So you guys can, again, you can pick really any point that you want. You can pick the one on the axis, the low. You could pick this one here, this high point, or this axis point, okay? Again, all of these equations will give you the same graph, just a different equation. Okay, so 2 more. So you got letter D. So this looks to be about the lowest point. That's negative 2.5. And then the highest point looks to be about negative 1.5. Okay, so the middle of that is going to be negative 2. All right, so that's my value for D. So D would be negative 2. All right, now I'm going a half unit above and half unit below. All right, so that tells me that my amplitude has to be 1/2. Okay, now my period, right, if I'm starting here at x equals 0, the period finishes there at 4 pi. Okay, so my period is 4 pi. So B must be 1/2. Okay, now I can write my equation. All right, so because this is a low point, it's going to be negative cosine. Okay, so this is y equals negative 1/2 cosine of 1/2 x minus 2. All right, and then the next point would be an axis point. All right, so this is going to be y equals, now, because I'm starting at the axis point and I'm going up, this is going to be positive sine. So 1/2 sine of 1/2. Now my shift to the right looks to be by a unit of pi. So x minus pi, and then minus 2. Okay. And then your last one. All right, so the lowest value is negative 3. The highest value would be 5, okay? So the middle of that is going to be positive 1. You're going to go 4 higher and 4 lower. All right, so that's, the axis is there at 1, and then the amplitude is 4, okay? Now your period, if I start here at 0, my period finishes at pi over 2. So that's a period of pi over 2. And then so the B term, 2 pi over pi over 2 is going to be 4 pi over pi and just 4. Okay. Okay, so let's do, all right, we're going to start here, the highest point. So we have y equals amplitude of 4 cosine. My period, or my B term, sorry, is going to be 4x plus 1. Okay. Okay, now my last one that I have to write is going to be based off of this point. Now, if you look at that, where that point is, that's not really in the middle of 0 and pi over 6. Okay, so I'm going to need to do a little extra work here. Now, I know that my period goes from 0 to pi over 2, right? Now, the middle of that, right, is going to be right here, all right? Now, if you divide pi over 2 by 2, you get pi over 4. Okay, so the middle of that is going to be pi over 4. Okay, so that's going to be this value down here is going to be at pi over 4. Now to figure out the value that I need right here, okay, that's going to be between 0 and pi over 4. Okay, so if I take pi over 4 and I divide it by 2, I'm going to get pi over 8. Okay, so this x value is going to be pi over 8. All right, so I'm just splitting the distance from 0 to pi over 4 in half. Okay, So now that I know that x value, I can write my equation. Okay. So it's like I'm going up by pi over 8. So I have pi over 8. 2 pi over 8 would be right here in the middle. And then this value here would be at 3 pi over 8. And then 4 pi over 8 is pi over 2. Okay. So if I go back to this one, it's going to be negative sine because we're going down. So negative 4 sine of the b term, which is 4, x minus pi over 8, and then plus 1. Okay? So again, it's kind of working backwards. If you guys, just pay attention to the specific points on the graph, then it's pretty easy just to write the equation for each one. Okay? So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.